The poem name is called as Learning Urdu, which is written by, what is his name? I forgot what. What is his name? Yes. So, Learning Urdu by Agha Shahid Ali. Look at the stanza by stanza discussion. So, in which we find out the first line where the poet stated, yeah, it is the poem which is taken from DAC 3, Unit 2, right? DAC 3, Unit 2, and it is the second poem, right? And the poem name is called the Learning Urdu by Agha Shahid Ali. So, the first stanza where the poet stated, from a district near Jammu, Dogri stumbling through his Urdu. He comes, the victim of a continent broken in two in 1947. So, the speaker here introduces a person, right, who comes from a region near Jammu, from a district near Jammu, a place which is affected by the partition of India in the year of 1947. So, the person speaks Dogri, Togri. In the bracket, it is written Dogri stumbling through his Urdu. Dogri stumbling through his Urdu. So, the person speaks Dogri. What is Dogri? Dogri is a regional language, right? But struggles with Urdu, which is more refined and poetic. Got my point? So Urdu is more refined and poetic, whereas what is that? Dogri. Dogri is a regional language. Got the point? So the poet here stated means he comes the victim of a continent broken in two in 1947. So the man is a victim. Man who speaks Dogri is a victim of the partition of India. The meaning of partition of India is called as when the India got its means separation into two different nations. One is India and the other one is Pakistan. So in that partition of India, when the country was divided into India and Pakistan, it causes immense violence and displacement. Immense violation means called as a huge violation, right? Sorry, huge violence and also displacement. Displacement means called as a displaced from the place where you are living. So the poet stated that he mentions the mainstay he ate. He mentions the mainstay he ate while men desert in alphabets of blood, in syllables of death, of hate. So he mentions what? The mainstay he ate while men desert in alphabets of blood, in syllables of death, of hate. The man describes how the air was filled with violence. How the air was filled with violence. That is what he pointed. He mentions what? The mainstay air. So the mainstay air means called the air filled with violence and suffering. Right. So while men dissolve in alphabet, it means the phrase men dissolved in alphabets of blood, suggests that people were killed in a way that their identities, it means their names, their words, their languages, they all were lost in the bloodshed. They all were lost in the bloodshed. So then the poet stated in syllables of death, of hate. So syllables of death, of hate means what? Now it refers to the hatredness, hateful, and the propaganda. So when you say that propaganda means called as a kind of a rumor or a kind of a thoughts that spread during that time, right? Or during that time, which time? When the country gets separated, isn't it? So that is what the first stanza, where it is clearly stated, from a district near Jammu, Dogri stumbling through his Urdu, he comes the victim of a continent broken in two in 1947. He mentions the mainstay he ate while men dissolved in alphabet of bloods, in syllables of death, of hate. So the poet clearly stated nothing but the poet introduces a person who belongs to the Dogri, who belongs to a place called Jammu, and he knows well the regional language Dogri, but he could not speak the fine language called Urdu, isn't it? So, and that person was very much suffered because of the what? Because of the separation and displacement that occurred in the country then in the year of 1947. So we also find out that in the stanza 2, I only remember half the word. I only remember half the word that was my village. The rest I forget. My memory belongs to the line of blood across which my friends desert into bitter stanzas of some dead poet. So the poet stated in the second stanza that the man who knew Dogri, the regional language, so the man cannot fully remember even the name of his village. Right? So, why? Now, because of the trauma of partition. Because of the trauma of partition. What do you mean by trauma? That called as a shock. Right? It's a kind of a shock that happens because of the partition, separation. So that was my village, the rest I forget. So his past is fragmented. Fragmented means called as a separation. So his past is completely disappeared from his mind, just like the country was separated. Right. Similar to that, the past was also disappeared from his mind. My memory belongs to the line of blood across which my friends dissolved into bitter stanzas of some dead poet. So the poet states that his memories are tied. His memories are tied to the border created by violence. So the line of blood refers to the partition border. The line of blood refers to the partition border. So his friends were lost. He said that what my friends deserved. It means his friends were lost, much like lines in poetry filled with sorrow. So, like the poetry, when you read, you feel the kind of a sadness, unhappy situation. The phrase "some dead poet," the phrase "some dead poet" suggests what? That the pain of partition. The pain of partition is like the words of poets who wrote about suffering. Who wrote about suffering? That the poet who wrote the poetry, and that the poetry or the verses represents nothing but the suffering, right? So, and that suffering is clearly indicating the pain of partition. Partition means that called as how the country gets separated. So, stanza 3 stated what? He wanted me to sympathize. He wanted me to sympathize. I could not. He wanted me to sympathize means that the person, that the man whom did the author or whom did the poet introduce, right? So the poet stated that he wanted me to sympathize or show kindness. I could not. So the man wanted the speaker to feel what? To feel his pain. So, but the speaker could not fully relate, right? Could not fully relate because somebody who experiences and somebody who did not wanted to know about it would not feel the same kind of emotion, isn't it? So he wanted me to sympathize. I could not. So I was only interested in the bitter couplet, which I wanted him to explain. We continue. So the poet stated that instead of I was only interested in the bitter couplets. It means instead of feeling deep emotions, for the man's suffering, the poet who did not find out the same kind of emotions, the poet stated that instead of feeling deep emotions for the man's suffering, which man? The man who knew the Dodri, right, and belonged to Jammu. So the speaker is more focused on the what? More focused on the poetry. More focused on the poetry about pain. So bitter couplets. Bitter couplets refers to what? The sad and emotional poetry, like about partition and loss. Like about partition and loss. Yes, come. Did you meet your principal, sir? Yes. No issue. Okay, no issue. Means I'll give you some details. Right, I'll also talk to principal. That also be a fine one. Please ask her whether she knew about it or not. Right. If she did not, then what is the use of talking to her? And by the way, why don't you talk to Praveen sir and the madam if they know about something? Because sir told political science and commerce department. They then ask and try to get the full details. You need to write that. You send it to me, and I'll also send you if I get some good information. Right? Good. Okay. Let's have a next stanza. The next stanza is stanza 4. In that, where we find out, and I who knew mere backwards, and I who knew mere backwards, every couplet from the Divan-e-Ghalib, so Divan-e-Ghalib, so saw poetry dissolve into letters of blood. So, and I know, and I who knew mere backwards, right? The poet says that the man who knew Urdu poetry deeply, the man who knew Urdu poetry deeply, the poet stated about another man who knew Urdu poetry deeply, memorizing whom? Mir and Ghalib. We know that Mir and Ghalib. Who are the Mir and Ghalib? The Mir and Ghalib are the, means you can say, famous Urdu poets, isn't it? So, and I who knew mere backwards, every couplet from the Divan-e-Ghalib saw poetry dissolve into letters of blood. But now, after witnessing the horrors of partition, partition, poetry no longer feels like poetry. Poetry no longer feels like poetry. It feels like bloodshed. So that's what he stated. Every couplet from the Divan-e-Ghalib saw poetry dissolve into letters of blood. Isn't it? So in the stanza 5, you would find out which would be the last stanza. In this stanza, the poet stated, he now remembers nothing while I find Ghalib. He now remembers nothing while I find Ghalib at the crossroads of language, refusing to move to any side, masquerading as a beggar to see my theater of kindness. Right. Now you find out lots of difficult words are there. The first line said, he now remembers nothing while I find Ghalib. So the poet stated that now the man has lost. Now the man has lost his deep knowledge. Deep knowledge of what? Deep knowledge of poetry. Right. So his trauma, his shock has erased it. What kind of a shock? What kind of a trauma? The trauma of, means you can say, the trauma refers to nothing but the partition trauma. So that partition trauma has erased it. Erased, you understand, disappear from his mind. So he now remembered nothing while I find Ghalib at the crossroads of language. So the speaker also said that the speaker finds the poet whose name is Ghalib. So at a crossroad of language. When we say that crossroads of language, it's symbolizing how language itself was caught between what? Hindi and Urdu. Caught between Hindi and Urdu, India and Pakistan, isn't it? So that's what the speaker finds, that what the poet Ghalib, a crossroad of language. So the meaning of crossroad of language is indicating nothing but how Urdu and Hindi both are in a kind of a confusing state, right? So they have been caught between nothing but a Hindi and Hindi and Urdu, like India and Pakistan, right? So you also find out that refusing to move to any side. When you say that refusing to move to any side, it means that what Ghalib represents something beyond political. Ghalib represents something what beyond political and religious divisions. So religious divisions means what? He did not become the part of the politics. He did not become the part of the religion, right? So, but at the same time, Ghalib means goes beyond politics and goes beyond religion, isn't it? So even the poet stated, masquerading as a beggar to see my theater of kindness. The speaker imagines that what Ghalib masquerading as a beggar. What do you mean by masquerading? Masquerading is called as artificial appearance, right? So artificial appearance means somebody who is not called as Ghalib, right? Ghalib before the separation and after the separation, isn't it? So the speaker imagines Ghalib masquerading as a beggar, as if poetry has been reduced to poetry has been not considered as a poetry. Poetry has been reduced to begging, right? So poetry has reduced to begging for attention in a world that is divided by politics and suffering, right? So that is divided by politics and suffering. So these five stanzas given in this poem clearly indicating about what? That how the poem explores the pain of partition through the goal of a man who has lost his home, right? So not only his home, his friends, and even his connection to the poetry. So while he struggles with it, while he means referring to the means man, right? So who suffers in the partition. So struggles with his trauma. The speaker is more interested in what? More interested in understanding Urdu, right? Urdu poetry. And that shows a contrast between what? Personal suffering and intellectual interest. Personal suffering and intellectual curiosity. So the poem also highlights what? How language, especially Urdu, that became a victim of history. So Urdu language is nothing but a what? Become a means or sorry, Urdu language became a means a victim of history. History means what? Because of the partition, what happened? The language reduces its charm, right? So, and caught between the two nations, India and Pakistan, isn't it? So, therefore, you can find out the poem title "Learning Urdu" is means it's considered as the aptitude. Why? Because it suggests an exploration of a language. It suggests an exploration of language, identity, and history. However, as the poem unfolds, it becomes clear that what learning Urdu is not just about mastering a language, so but also about understanding the deeper pain and historical wounds. Won't you understand that injury mark wounds associated with it? The poem revolves around a man. Revolves means what? Moves around a man. So from the Jammu and Kashmir who did not know Urdu language or who did not have a proficiency in Urdu language but have a good knowledge in Dogri, right? So who once had a deep connection with the Urdu poetry but lost it due to the traumatic events of partition, traumatic events of partitions. So therefore, you can talk about that learning Urdu, right? Title have a two types of meaning. On the surface, it refers to the speaker's attempt to understand Urdu poetry, particularly the works of Mir and Gali, the poets, right? On a deeper level, if you go deeper side of it, you would find out it symbolizes an attempt to hold the emotional and historical weight carried by what? The language, especially in the context of the separation, partition, right? So, in that case, Urdu is considered nothing but a symbol of identity. Urdu is a symbol of what? Symbol of loss, right? So, the man in the poem once knew Urdu well, but after experiencing partition, he sees it as letters of blood. He sees it as what? Letters of blood. And this transformation shows what? how language is not just a means of what communication, but also a witness to what historical suffering, right? So the speaker, however, focuses more on the poetry rather than the pain behind it, isn't it? And indicating a gap between academic interest and lived experience, isn't it? Therefore, you can say the poem as well as the title is justified, right? Both the uh, intellectual interest means called as to grasp the knowledge of Urdu poetry and the emotional struggle of those who lived through partition, isn't it? So, and that's what making this point powerful and a layered choice, one after another. So, yes, you would also find out some poetic devices in this poem. So, poetic devices that we talk about, literary devices or poetic devices, just to know that you find out the poetic devices called imagery. So, what is that imagery? The poem is rich in visual, emotional image that brings the historical suffering to life. Like you can say, minced, minced, minced air he ate, minced air he ate. So the meaning of minced air he ate means called as a pollution, polluted, right? So alphabets of blood and syllables of death of hate. So if you see that minced air he ate, it suggests suffocation, violence, and destruction caused by partition. If you talk about alphabets of blood, syllables of death, of hate, that creates nothing but a terrible image of language that being tainted by violence. Even if you talk about dissolved into letters of blood, dissolves into letters of blood, you can imagine a letter which is written in a blood, right? So a powerful image showing how even literature and poetry were consumed by the horrors of partition. So beside imagery, you also find out metaphor. Metaphor is called as compare emotions and historical events. Like you can talk about line of bloods. When you say line of bloods, that represents what the border created by the partition, which is separated friends, families, isn't it? Neighbors. So second is called as bitter stanzas of some dead poets. Bitter stanzas of some dead poets suggest that tragic events of partition during are turned into sad poetry where history itself became a painful verse. Even you also find out theater of kindness. Theater of kindness is another phrase that implies acts of kindness in the aftermath of such tragedy that might be performative rather than genuine or authentic. So then, beside imagery, metaphor, you also find out personification. When you talk about personification, we understood given human qualities to abstract concepts. Human qualities to abstract concepts. Like poetry dissolves into letters. Poetry dissolves into letters of blood. Like it suggests that poetry, which should be a source of beauty, which should be a source of beauty and expression, and it was overtaken by violence and loss. So, even personification, we find out Ghalib at the crossroad of language. When you say Ghalib at the crossroad of language, refusing to move to any side, here we understood Ghalib, or Ghalib is imagined as a figure that is caught between India and Pakistan separation, political and linguistic divisions, political and linguistic divisions, and that symbolizes the destiny or a fate of Urdu itself. Right. So then you find out the fourth one, which is called as the allusion. Allusion is again another poetic devices that takes the reference famous Urdu poets like Mir and Diwane-e Sahib, right? Or sorry, Diwane-e Ghalib. So these are the direct references. Allusion means reference. So Mir and Diwane-e Ghalib, so these are direct references to legendary Urdu poets whose name is called as Mir Taki Mir, and Mirza Ghalib. Mir Taqi Mir and Mirza Ghali. So these are the two famous poets who are emphasizing the importance of Urdu literature in shaping cultural identity, isn't it? So we also find out symbolism. Like symbolism means what? Object and phrases that presents larger ideas. So beggar, when you say beggar, the poet imagines Ghalib as a beggar who is begging, right? So and symbolizing what how Urdu poetry and language have been marginalized after partition, so they don't have any importance after partition, right? So crossroads of language. When you say crossroads of language, we talk about it symbolizes the conflict between Hindi and Urdu and the divisions created by history, isn't it? Then we find out the next one, which is called as a juxtaposition. What do you mean by juxtaposition? It means in poetry there is a contrast, right? So the point contrasts intellectual curiosity. So contrast with what? Intellectual interest. With what? With the personal suffering. So suffering that goes against the intellectual curiosity. When you are hungry, you don't think about what knowledge. You always want to fulfill your hungry stomach, isn't it? Similar to that, when somebody is facing for personal suffering, and the other side you are finding that means intellectual curiosity. So obviously, intellectual curiosity is not that important because personal suffering is more important than that. So the speaker is interested in Urdu poetry, but the man from Jammu has lost his connection to it. Why? Because of the trauma, because of the personal suffering, because of the partition. So Urdu, that once a beautiful poetic language, is now what described in terms of blood and violence. That shows how partition changed its perception, right? Then the last one is called as a tone. Tone is what? The tone shifts throughout the poem. Like you can say, the tone of the poem is called as a nostalgia, melancholic. Now, what do you mean by nostalgia? Nostalgia means remembering the past events. Melancholic means what? That called as when you feel sad and remembering the poetry. So here the man recalls his past and love for Urdu poetry. That is why you can say the tone is nostalgic and melancholic. Detached and academic. When you talk about detached and academic, when the speaker focuses on understanding Urdu poetry without deeply engaging with the man's suffering or man's pain, isn't it? So, third is called as a reflective and ironic. When you say reflective and ironic, when Ghalib is imagined as a beggar called a reflective, reflection. So, and hinting at the decline of Urdu in post-partition India. Right. Post-partition India means after India got its separation and become a means one, right. So in that become a two separate nations. So post-partition India where Urdu poetry is declining, isn't it? So these are the poetic devices that highlight and also decorate the poem beautifully. So finally, I would say that what the poem effectively mixed what history, personal loss, and linguistic exploration, language exploration. It gives you the knowledge about Urdu, importance of Urdu. The title Learning Urdu is meaningful. Why? Because it reflects both the speaker's attempt to understand Urdu poetry and the deeper emotional and historical connection to the language, especially in the context of partition, isn't it? So, through vivid imagery, metaphors, and symbolism, Agha Shahid Ali, who is he? Agha Shahid Ali is the poet of this poem, right? So highlights how Urdu, once a language of poetry and culture, became entangled, got confused in the trauma of partition, partition, making its learning not just an academic interest, but a journey into history and identity. Understood? That is what the point is. I hope you are clear with this. So if you come tomorrow, then I'll not tomorrow. Day after 2. Huh? Yes, I will be busy as well.